Welcome back to class. In this session, we're going to take a break from looking at the themes in the Jürgen textbook, and we're going to take a moment to think about the semester research project. Now please, before you go any further in this video, if you have not yet read the research project guide that's posted on Canvas, please do so now. It's not my intention here to review that document and go over all the different grading policies and whatnot. Rather, what I'd like to do with this time is to take you through the process once you have read the research project guide, to take you through the process of developing a topic and to give you some ideas of ways to search for evidence and primary sources on which to base your final term paper. The prime mandate of your research project is to explain a historical change from diverse perspectives. And the writing research project guide gives you a set of rules about those diverse perspectives. So you can pick any topic that is in some way obviously related to the themes in Jürgen. The research project guide tries to give you lots and lots of different examples, the kinds of things that you might think about. So your first perspective that you need to consider for your final paper is Jürgen's perspective, right? You want to be able to explain the subject that I'm looking at is relevant and important to Jürgen's text in the following ways. Here's the places where Jürgen discusses it, and this is why it's important to his analysis. I'm going to look at this particular example of, or I'm going to look at an example that he didn't think of and talk about its relationship to Jürgen's analysis. So your paper is devoted to explaining the change. The before, then something happened, and there was an after, right? It's just that simple. And now you want to think about a total of 4 perspectives that you're going to try to identify on that change. 2 different perspectives, what we call primary historical perspectives, that is evidence that shows the experience of those who participated in the historical change, those who were directly impacted by the historical change, people who were alive and reporting their experience while the change was going on. And then 2 secondary historical perspectives, that is to say, the perspectives of someone who is watching the change from some kind of distance, and that distance you can think of in different ways. So for historians and for the field of history, we typically think of that in chronological terms, right? Thomas Jefferson and Tom Paine were historical actors who left documents expressing their primary historical view, and we contemporary academics, historians, scholars, when we write texts about what Thomas Jefferson and Tom Paine thought, we're writing secondary historical perspectives. So Daniel Jürgen's text is a kind of paradigmatic secondary historical perspective, right? He's a modern author and he's looking back on what all these people in the past experienced. So one obvious way to think about what am I going to do for my secondary perspectives is to think about 2 other texts that are kind of modern academic textbooks like Jürgen's. Now, maybe they're focused where Jürgen just mentions this thing in passing in one chapter. You're going to go find 2 scholars who write works, articles, or books specifically about that subject, right? So they'll be more focused and concentrated. But that's not the only way to think about secondary perspectives, right? It doesn't have to be modern academic texts. You might think about, say, the Valdez oil spill, looking at newspaper reporting and different public assembly declarations and whatnot from the people who live in Valdez, Alaska, and then at the very same time the way 2 national observers, say an pro-environmentalist group and an anti-environmentalist say the API, the American Petroleum Institute, those views might be happening at the same time, right? They might be coterminous in time, but one is by the people who are actually living in the muck, right? The oil on the shore, right? And cleaning it up. And then the others are remove their national perspectives. Or you might think about, sort of within a country, say, some political event in the nationalization of oil in one of the post-colonial states, and finding sources from, say, Iranians or Saudi Arabians or whoever about what's going on in their country, and then thinking about, say, American or European perspectives on what's happening within Saudi Arabia as your secondary perspectives. Does that make sense? Your final term paper is about explaining this change that happened and the differences between the views of the people who participated and experienced it and the views of people who stand at some distance removed. And that distance removed is really a conceptual relationship, right? It could be in time, but it could be geography, or you might think of other ways of thinking about perspectives that are removed from the experience of those people who are actually having the change happen to them. So your final term paper must have a minimum of 5 research sources of evidence, right? Jurgen, 2 primary documents, and 2 secondary documents or sources. There is no one right way to go through the process of developing the topic for your term paper. You may well have a kind of foundation in material related to Jurgen from your own coursework. Definitely, if you're an engineer, you may be familiar with any one of the kind of developments in automobiles, or if you're an architect, you may be very familiar with suburbanization and the development of new house design. So it's not necessary, in other words, to go through the exact process that I'm going to show you here. This is just one kind of practical path that you could take to thinking through the subject that you want your term paper to be on. So I'm going to start primarily in Jurgen, and if you would at all follow the news, you may be familiar that there's a war going on in Ukraine right now. Russia invaded Ukraine several years ago, and if you recall the news coverage, we don't talk about it so much in the coverage today, but one of the most controversial policies, or one controversial policy that the West adopted when Russia invaded Ukraine in order to punish Russia, was both the United States, Canada, and the European Union imposed oil sanctions or an oil embargo on Russian oil. That is to say, the United States and Europe are the most important, refused to buy Russian oil in order to not fund the Russian government to penalize it for its invasion of Ukraine. Now, it's a funny kind of penalty, right? Because you are refusing to hand over your money to someone who's doing something that you don't want them to do, but at the same time, you're penalizing yourself. Especially in Europe, the effect of the embargo on Russian oil is to limit the supplies of oil. Russia had been a major exporter of oil, to especially natural gas, to Europe. And so Europeans are paying substantially more for their energy today than they were before they imposed this embargo on Russia. So you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot, right, by trying to impose this penalty on someone who's doing something you don't like. And there are, of course, embargo plays a critical role in the Jurgen text, especially with the rise of OPEC and the 2 embargoes in 1967 and 1973. And so a topic that occurred to me as an example to show you is, because it's in the news today, to think about the history of embargoes and evaluate whether or not they work. So an easy place to begin is just to turn in your Jurgen textbook. If you look in the index, if you look up embargoes, you'll see, and if you flip through the index, what you'll see is of all the topics listed there, embargoes is one of those with the most citations to the text, right? So if you just are trying to come up with an idea, you don't know what you want to write your term paper on, if you have absolutely no other place to start from kind of personal interest or your own background, then just turn to the index of Jurgen. Start flipping through it, look at all the different subjects it lists, and if you find a subject with lots of page numbers, right, cited after it, you're going to stumble onto a recurring theme. Right? So if you have no other place to begin, this is as good a place as any. So if you go through those examples that are listed here and you kind of recreate a thread within the Jurgen textbook, right? So now instead of thinking about each individual chapter, I'm just trying to tell myself the story of embargoes as it's expressed in Jurgen. And you could put together a little list like this. These are the most important embargoes. I think they're all the embargoes that Jurgen discusses in the textbook. And a funny thing, if you start listing them together, becomes immediately apparent. They're overwhelmingly failures, right? So I did not assign you the chapters on World War II, so you may not have covered this material, but preceding Pearl Harbor, after the Japanese invasion of the Korean Peninsula, the United States imposed an oil embargo on Japan, and if you recall from my summaries in the class videos, Japan was overwhelmingly dependent on American oil at that point. So that's the one example where you could say, yes, the embargo succeeded. We crippled the Japanese industry, but it only led to war. It only led to Japan then taking the entire South Pacific to try to get the oil fields of the Dutch West Indies, if you recall. All the other embargoes that Jurgen discusses fail over and over and over again. Now, the 1973 OPEC embargo is the one exception here, and you can say OPEC succeeded at least with the limited goal or the limited impact of absolutely crippling the Western economies, right? So to that extent, it was devastating, but it did not succeed in preventing the Israelis from winning the October War, and it certainly didn't prevent the Israelis from invading again in Lebanon in the 1980s, et cetera, et cetera. So if the goal of the OPEC embargo was to prevent this action by Israel and the United States, then it was a failure. If the goal was to impose a horrible penalty or a horrible cost on those powers for doing what they were doing, then you could say it was a kind of success. So there's this remarkable thing about embargoes, they just don't seem to work, right? And we see them over and over again. Now, if you look at this list of embargoes, though, the one from 1951, when Iran and Mohammad Mossadegh, etc., were trying to nationalize Iranian oil, and Britain prohibits people from purchasing. It essentially does what the United States and Europe is doing in 2022. That is to say, that's very different than all these other embargoes where the producers of oil are refusing to sell. Right? So it's one thing if I'm a buyer of oil and I say, I'm not going to buy your oil, I'm so mad at you. It's a different kind of economic coercion if I'm the producer of oil and I say to you, I refuse to sell to you. Now, in formal economics, we would distinguish that between an embargo and a boycott, right? But Jurgen sort of uses those terms interchangeably, so are we. So one idea then of how to assess this question, do embargoes, oil embargoes or boycotts work, is to think about the unique case, and especially thinking about, the European embargo on Russian oil with the most recent Ukrainian oil. One interesting kind of analytical hook or question to ask is it different, or why is it different, or how is it different when we try to prohibit the purchase of oil as opposed to a country refusing to sell oil? So now I have a kind of, not only a theme or a subject, but I have a kind of analytical interest, a kind of outcome assessment that I'm going to engage in with this topic. Now, if you start with a topic from Jurgen and you review the sections of Jurgen that treat that topic and then follow the footnotes that Jurgen provides, you may find any number of either primary or secondary sources in those footnotes, and that at least gives you some breadcrumbs to start following, right? This is not by any means an exhaustive list. Jurgen's text is published in the mid 90s, so it won't contain sources from the past quarter century. There are many more modern sources than Jurgen will have, but this is a place for you to get a toehold to start orienting yourself towards what you're searching for. So with the embargo sections, you can see here I extracted the secondary sources that Jurgen cites, and you can see just from the authors and the titles a variety of perspectives on the subject matter. Some sort of methodological. You can see topics here that are more oriented towards politics, others that are more oriented towards economics, and you can sort of infer from the subject, from the titles and the authors' names, that some of these authors are sort of Westerners, Americans or Brits, and at least a couple of them may be Iranians, or at least expressing the Iranian point of view. So where do you get your hands on these texts if you find them in Jurgen? We actually have the Lawrence Tech Library. Its search engine is actually very effective and powerful. There aren't all that many sources that are available in the LTU library, but if any of these texts are available in a digital edition, you have a really good chance of being able to access the digital text through the LTU homepage. And even if you can't get your hands on the text itself, you are very likely to identify the citation and find references to databases where it can be. Now, some of those you will have access to, and some of them you won't. But the LTU library homepage and that search, and the advanced search function in there, is actually a very effective place to begin. You will be familiar with at least some of these other internet sources: the Internet Archive, the Gutenberg Project, Project Muse. You may not have heard of JSTOR. That's a giant repository of academic journals that you can search. All of these are accessible for you by just signing up for a free account if you don't already have one for these. And you will find many of these texts in sort of JPEG versions, right? Photo image version, page by page of each of these texts. Now, if you can find the citations for any of these texts, look at the subjects that are listed in that citation and just click on that subject, and you can continue to search for related texts, and that may very well take you to more modern academic works. Now, these are all sort of classic academic texts, right? Classic secondary sources. I'm not going to read all of these in their entirety. First of all, I would think I was lucky if I could actually get my hands on half of these, right, by searching for them. When I actually look at the text, I'm just going to skim the table of contents, the chapter titles. I might flip through and look and see if there are maps and images that tell me the subject matter. I'm going to look in the index for the British oil boycott and just review those sections, right? So that becomes a secondary source, but as I'm reviewing this, I'm looking for the mention of names of people, names of companies, names of government departments, treaties or documents that are mentioned. Any of those things that are mentioned in these texts, I'm going to do a quick Google search on, right, and see what I can come up with, or I'm going to search in Internet Archive for these key headings. And so these secondary sources are very likely to lead me to further ideas and clues about primary sources that I could search for. Now, this process, this is what research is in the social sciences, in history and political science, etc. It's indeterminate. You don't know exactly what you're looking for. You're just following breadcrumbs and clues. Again, what you're the end goal here is to have Jurgen and those four sources, evidentiary sources, for your four perspectives, 2 primary and 2 secondary perspectives. And all we're doing is we're following breadcrumbs, right? We're following clues to our search until we're satisfied that we have the right evidence to write a paper that will fulfill the requirements of the research project. So these are clues. I'm going to find as many of these as I can in these internet search engines. I don't expect to be able to find all of them. I think I'll find the citations for all of them. I don't think I'll find the actual text to read for all of them. If I can find half or more, I think I'll be doing really well. But when I find them, they're going to then give me clues to go on to further sources. Now, from reviewing this material, Jurgen and whatever secondary sources that I can come up with, I'm going to think of key terms, keywords that I can do. Google searches, I'm sure ChatGPT has a much more advanced function for this. You're welcome to use that. You're just thinking of different search terms that you can use that will show you what's available, accessible on the internet in terms of primary sources. So 20-30 minutes of doing random Google searches on the subject of this British boycott, 1951 boycott of Iranian oil, allowed me to come up with these sources. And you can see the range of material that's available out there. If you search the United Nations, you'll come up with a whole series of kind of subunits. The International Court of Justice and the World Bank are both parts of the United Nations. And so when you're searching, you'll go into the United Nations website and it'll take you to these different subunits. You see that I have the International Court of Justice's judgment in the case of United Kingdom versus Iran. Now, I was just quickly able to survey that for the purposes of doing my abstract and annotated bibliography, and I'll decide later, once I've reviewed all the evidence, which of these pieces I want to use to write my paper on. There's a World Bank report on the nationalization of the Iranian oil industry. I found we've mentioned Mohammad Mossadegh, the Prime Minister of Iran. He has a website devoted, it's just called MohammadMossadegh.com, library, and it's full of his works. I found these two among those listed in the works that appear particularly relevant to this topic, right? His life and memoirs, I'm sure, will tell the story of his trial and imprisonment, and the nationalization of oil in Iran, I expect, will tell his plan, right? His public policy plan for nationalizing oil. This Norman Kemp first-hand account of the Persian oil crisis, I can guess by the author's name that he may be a Brit, right? And Abadan is the name of the city where the major British oil refineries are. So I'm expecting to find here an account by a British oil refinery worker about his experience during the nationalization crisis. I have a report from the British Broadcasting Corporation, which sort of tells you what the British press was telling the British public about. And again, newspapers are wonderful sources. Virtually every from the New York Times to the Los Angeles Times to the London papers. Their modern websites, many, especially the major papers, have archived every single edition of the newspaper going back 100 years or more, right? Going all the way back through the 20th century. So if you're thinking about an event like this oil embargo, go to the New York Times website and look through issues of the paper around the dates that these events are happening. You're very likely to come upon a newspaper article that describes the event. And then I have two American documents, the CIA secret report on the overthrow of Prime Minister Mossadegh, and then this collection Iran from the U.S. State Department. Now, not all of these sources are directly relevant to the question, are oil boycotts where the purchasers are refusing to buy fundamentally different than oil embargoes where producers are refusing to sell, right? That was my initial analytical question. Some of these sources may be directly relevant to that. Some of these may lead me to further sources, right? So who knows what's in this U.S. State Department collection? I have to get in and sort through there, but there may be economic analyses of the crisis among those papers. So I have to be prepared to allow my subject of my term paper to evolve in relation to the sources that I find. I might not find the exact data that I need or material that I need to fulfill my original question, so I have to allow that question to evolve as I find sources that I want to work with. So the first step of this research project is to do an abstract and annotated bibliography, right? I do not expect in this initial assignment that you have worked out the exact precise language or argument that you're going to use in your final paper. What I expect to see from you is the results of your attempt to do a survey of the material valuable, to think through the requirements of the kind of narrative or analytical structure required, the primary view versus secondary view, etc., and then to produce for me this week 2 documents, an abstract that summarizes and a list of 10 sources. So on the screen here you see a kind of sketch and outline. I'm not going to cover every single one of these subjects, right? If you look on the 2 perspectives on change, and I have 4 different options on ways to think about 2 perspectives on change, once I work through my evidence, I will have to make a choice, right, of one of these, right? Iran versus Britain, Britain versus the United States, and that's going to be a matter of me reading the materials I found and then making coherent choices about assembling the final product. Well, all I'm doing here is sketching out the different directions this term paper may go based on the sources, my initial survey of the sources that I have, right? So I have a kind of idea of the direction I want to go. For your abstract and your annotated bibliography, first the abstract on the left-hand side of your screen, a page or 2, right? Think about 2 or 3 paragraphs, right? The example I have clipped for you here is just one dense paragraph, so it's going to miss a point or 2 for writing mechanics, but it compresses it so you can see it all on the screen, right? To think through the requirements that are described for you in the research project guide, relevance to a theme in Jurgen, the change that you want to examine, the primary, the secondary sources that you want to view, and the best sources that you found in your initial survey of evidence, right? So you're going to write out a 2 or 3 paragraph description of your project, and then for your annotated bibliography, the 10 best or most relevant sources that you found. And you're going to give me a quick citation, including the URL, so I can click on it and find the source, and just a few sentences that describe here's what's at this site, or here's what this source consists of. This is why I think it's relevant to what I'm working on. And most importantly, this is the point of view that this document represents, right? Think of that in terms of bias. Is it from the American Petroleum Institute website, right? Then it represents the oil company's points of view. Assess the bias or the perspective for each one of your sources of evidence. Now notice I'm requiring for the bibliography that you report 10 sources, and then I'm requiring you to use 4 of those as a minimum for your final paper, and that is part of the process that I'm asking you to go through. I'm asking you to go out and cast a big net, right? A big fishing net out in the water, haul it in, see what you catch in your net, and I want you to go through the process of sorting out, tossing away things that end up not being relevant and having specific reasons why you're keeping the evidence that you want to use for your final paper. This is the process of research, right? So find 10 sources for this bibliography, and then you're going to pick Jurgen plus your 4 best sources, again, as a minimum. You may have several sources related to the same perspective, right? A couple of different pro-environmentalist views on an oil spill or something like that, right? So it's not 4 is the minimum. You must have a evidence for your 2 primary perspectives and your 2 secondary perspectives. This is what I need you to submit for your abstract and annotated bibliography. Let's do first. Then I get a chance to review and give you feedback, right? You're going to go back and finish up Jurgen for the week following. Hopefully I get those turned around quick enough that then for the the writing of your final paper, you're going to go through and assess your evidence. You may need to go find yet more sources besides the 10 that you included, but you'll have a framework to kind of stew on. Now, I'm not giving you an example of the structure of the final term paper because that organization can vary a great deal from one subject to another, right? One paper might, like in this example that I've just gone through with you, start from a contemporary event. In this case, the Ukraine war and the sanctions on Russia and thinking about whether embargoes work. Some papers will start that way, right? There's a new alternative battery technology that just came out that's really interesting, and that's going to inspire me to look into the historical roots, right? What were the earliest electric battery innovations, and let's pick one to make the focus of this paper. Right? So some papers will be organized that way. Some papers will start with Jurgen, right, and do a kind of a detailed assessment of all the different places in Jurgen that mention this theme, and then fall from there into a historical change. Other papers will just start with the change, right? And it'll be organized very chronologically. Yet other papers will do kind of the 2 points of view. So they'll do, the pro-environmentalist point of view, a primary source and a secondary perspective, the anti-environmentalist group perspective, a primary perspective, and a secondary perspective. All of those can be appropriate ways to organize your final term paper. So I'm not going to give you an outline of that here in this session. What I want you to do immediately is to think through the requirements of the final paper, to go out and find a whole bunch of sources just by Googling and ChatGPTing, right, to find different sources. Look at those sources. Don't read them in detail and take notes. Just skim them and get a sense of what they are, and then give me an initial survey of what your final project will be here in the abstract and the annotated bibliography. Please reach out to me if you have questions, and especially stop by my office hours. I really am happy to just chat with you about your interests and try to give you some direction if I'm able to. So, good luck with the abstract and annotated bibliography. Let me know if you have any questions.